During my childhood, I can remember attending a whole variety of different styles of churches, big churches, small churches, lively churches, sleepy churches, everything in between. And I can remember for a time attending the Lutheran Church for a couple of years. And the Lutheran Church belongs to the denomination that emerged out of the Protestant Reformation under the leadership of Martin Luther, who broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. And we weren't there for very long, but I can remember a few things about the way the Lutheran Church did church. And can I just say, just in passing, that I can remember being told when I was at the Bible College in Edinburgh, I can remember being told that the greatest cure for legalism is travel. And I think that is so important, that the greatest cure for legalism is travel. And I believe that wholeheartedly, especially when it comes to the realm of the Christian church. There is great benefit, loved ones, of traveling to different churches. Yes, making sure they preach the gospel, that they stand on gospel principles, but seeing how other churches do church. What works? What doesn't work, to expose ourselves to different traditions. And one thing I remember about the Lutheran Church was the great white clerical robe that the minister would walk on stage, and it would be this flowing long robe. And as a boy of 10 or 11 years old, it just didn't seem fair that I had to wear my Sunday clothes to church, and this guy got to wear a bed sheet. You know, he got to wrap himself in a bed sheet that he could come on the stage and he could move his arms and the bed sheet would move around, and there I was in my Sunday clothes. It just didn't seem fair. But I can remember also sitting back and watching how they did the Lord's Supper. And it was a church that didn't usher the children out. It wasn't a church where children were to be seen and not heard, but the children were to be part of the celebration. They were to be sitting, watching, and listening and observing. And I think that's actually, the more I think of that, the more I realize that that's actually really important for the young people to see how the old people do spirituality, how the spiritual formation of the older generation can make the impact in the younger generation. And I remember watching from a distance. And as a boy, it all just seemed so outlandish. The adults were invited to come to the front in a line. They had these wafers that would be passed out. The minister would give a wafer to each person. He would say a blessing. The cup of wine would be given to each person participating. And it would always happen at the time of the service. The service would always happen that way, right at lunchtime. And so, you know, your breakfast is long since worn off. You know, the eggs and the toast that you had is long gone, and you're thinking about lunchtime, and there I am as a boy. Everybody else is getting a snack, and I'm not getting a snack at all. It didn't seem fair. But it was on those occasions of waiting and watching and of wondering, the whole thing intrigued me. It was a service that was designed to encourage, but to also prompt questions from the children who were watching the events unfold. And we're going to come back to that in the next few moments as we think about the Lord's Supper that Jesus institutes now. And so we have our eyes open. We have our eyes on Mark's gospel. And at this point in the story, we are told that this is the time of Passover. This is the Passover celebrated in the Jewish year. And in Judaism, there are major festivals. There are festivals, but the three major festivals that required people to travel to Jerusalem were the Shavuot, the Sukkot, but also of Passover. And Mark helpfully identifies the time on the calendar when this story is taking place, and it's happening during Passover, a very special time in the Jewish year. And it was at this point in time where thousands of people would travel from all over Israel to come to Jerusalem. Thousands of people would descend upon the city, not all that different from match day in Newcastle, where you have all the fans descending into Newcastle to go to St. James's Park and all the venues around, and the atmosphere is electric, it is exciting, and people are arriving with great anticipation. But for us to really understand the magnitude of what Jesus now does with the Passover, we have to consider the Passover as it falls within ancient Israel. And we don't have a great deal of time. Time is of the essence, but we have the whole of the Old Testament, which is really the background music to what we have now in Mark's gospel. And in Exodus chapter 12, it's described for us. And in Exodus chapter 12, it's the Passover celebration is described for us that just before leaving Egypt, we learn in Exodus, God commands in verse 24, you shall observe this rite as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And immediately after that it's already anticipating questions being asked of little minds and eyes watching the events, as it would be the case, of my case, watching the events unfold in my childhood of the Lord's Supper in the Lutheran Church. It's already anticipated. And when your children, verse 26, and when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. There was a national celebration for all the Jews to participate and observe, from the oldest for the oldest member of the family to the very least in the family. Everyone in the family would be present. Just imagine everyone sitting around the table, enjoying the fellowship, children watching, giving the parents the opportunity to teach their children about their history, but also why they do what they do and the great reality of God's redemption. Children were to watch, to listen, to observe, and to ask questions. And during the Passover meal, it was customary for the youngest boy present to ask the father, who would then ask the father questions, and the father would then answer the questions by retelling the story of the Exodus. And from what I can remember and from what I can discern about how the Jewish Passover meal was structured, particularly within the first century, it would have been divided into 4 parts. Each part concluding with a glass of wine that was drunk purposefully, drunk solemnly, and reenacting the 4 stages of the Exodus. And we have it there in Exodus chapter 6. Therefore, to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people. And just put yourself for a moment at the table. Imagine for a moment the family gathered around the table. There is this blessing being spoken. There are the cups of wine being exchanged. The father would speak a blessing. The child would then ask the question, Dad, why are we doing this? Why is this night any different than any other night? And the dad would say to the son, well, son, it reminds us of our deliverance from Egypt. As we remember in Deuteronomy chapters 26, verses 5 to 9, and the son asks the question, what on earth is Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 to 9? And the dad says, let me tell you. And it's an opportunity for the father to instruct the children and the family, functioning like a catechism. And we're working through catechisms with our young people in junior church right now to share with them the opportunity to ask questions, but to also learn answers. There's different foods on the table, reminding them of their captivity in Egypt. There's unleavened bread, bitter herbs, roast lamb. Guests would be invited to partake in this. There would be the reciting of the worship songs, Psalm 113 perhaps, Psalm 114. And near the end of the feast, near midnight, there would be singing of hymns, perhaps Psalm 106, Psalm 118, and then the drinking of the last and 4th cup of wine. And so with Mark 14 open, Mark chapter 14, Jesus and his disciples are already, my speculation is they're already several hours into the feast at this point. And so the first cup of wine would have been drunk prior to the arrival of the meal. And we learn in verse 18 that they are reclining and are eating, which I estimate is somewhere in the middle of the feast, nearing the end of the festival. And the very heart of what you and I know today as the Lord's Supper is what we have there in verses 22 to 24. And that occurs around the same time as the 3rd cup of wine. And then we have verses 25 and 26, which is the conclusion of a hymn sing. And then we have the 4th cup of wine being drunk. And the more I thought about this, recognized and appreciated just how orderly and structured this meal was. The complete opposite of feeding time at our house, where it's chaos and people are grabbing and up and down and everywhere else, and it's feeding time at the zoo. But this is orderly. This is structured. This is a solemn remembrance of the wonder of God working in their history. And so, taking the historical consideration here, the first cup of wine would have been drunk prior to the meal. The second cup of wine would have been consumed just before the bread, followed by the third cup of wine, and the bread would arrive, and that's the matzah, that's the unleavened bread, the bread of affliction that would be passed around, and the father figure would then say a few words, perhaps quoting from the Old Testament, perhaps, it's my speculation, could be Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 3, eat it with unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that all the days of your life you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. The bread is distributed around the table, and everyone is getting ready to observe this in quiet, solemn reflection. Everything has been prepared. Everything has happened exactly as it happened in years previous. This was not new. This was an old, well-worn tradition. But then suddenly everything changes. Suddenly Jesus does something that no one has ever done before in the history of the world. Jesus does something, and he transforms this ceremony into something entirely new. And we have it there in verse 22. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." What? What on earth are you talking about? You can just imagine Peter sitting at the table. And this is impetuous Peter, who in verse 29 is going to tell Jesus that it's going to happen to everybody else. It's not going to happen to me. I'm going to stick closer to you, Jesus, than your best friend. I'm going to be like an octopus stuck to your face, Jesus. This is impetuous Peter. You're not going to get rid of me. Jesus, what are you doing? He's reading from the wrong script. Someone get him the common order of worship. He's reading the wrong service. Jesus, what are you doing? This isn't how it's supposed to go. And you can just imagine James or one of the other disciples, trying to keep Peter in his seat. Just listen to him. Just listen to what he's going to say. And that's my conjecture this morning, but I'm trying to convey the fact that this was never done before. This was entirely new. The most important festival in the Jewish calendar. And the disciples would have observed this from their earliest recollections in childhood. The routine, the prayers, the bread, the wine, the conversation, the hymn selection, and then all of a sudden Jesus does something entirely new, and he takes these words and he transforms them. We've got 7 verbs there in the Greek New Testament in verse 22, and he takes these 7 words and he uses them in a new way. Eat, took, blessed, broke, gave, said, take. Those are familiar. But Jesus does something new with them. Take, this is my body. And when it comes to the third drinking of the third cup, he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. And that would have been staggering. It would have been absolutely staggering for these disciples. The disciples are celebrating the Passover, and the hard unleavened bread seasoned with bitter herbs has always been symbolic of their experience in Egypt. It's always meant that. And here comes Jesus and does something entirely new with it. Why? Because in years to come, the next generation of Christians that gather around the table for fellowship won't be observing the Passover, but the Lord's Supper, remembering not freedom from captivity in Egypt, but freedom from their captivity to sin and bondage through the life-giving, atoning death of Jesus Christ on the cross. But considering what Jesus says about his body and blood, we can't make the mistake of over-literalizing this. This isn't anything mystical here. This is symbolic. We can't make the same mistake as some with transubstantiation, that something mystical happens at the Eucharist. This is symbolic of what Jesus is going to do and what future generations of Christians will remember in their fellowship, of symbolically feeding on him in faith and the knowledge of his work, through the assurance of his person and the encouragement found in his word, his promise, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And so taking the bread and the cup and describing it in this way, it's symbolic of what Jesus is going to accomplish on their behalf in the next 72 hours. The Jewish men at the table, they would have known what a covenant was. They would have understood the significance of the blood of the springtime lamb in Egypt. But Jesus frames the whole thing in a new way. He transforms it. Instead of thinking about Egypt and redemption, you're going to gather together and think about Jesus, your Redeemer. The blood that was shed on the cross is the blood that was shed for the full remission of your personal sin. In the same way, instead of pondering over the bitter bread of affliction that your ancestors ate, this time moving forward, my body is what you're going to be considering. Broken on your account. This will be the new covenant that God makes with men and women through his son Jesus Christ, that through the substitutionary sacrificial death on the cross, this Jesus is the Christ. As Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, this is the Christ, our Passover lamb, that has been sacrificed for us. With the bread being shared and the third cup being drunk, that leads into the conclusion of the service with a concluding hymn, and we see that there in Mark chapter 14, verse 26, which would have concluded the service with the drinking of the last fourth cup of wine, which I don't believe Jesus drinks based on what he says in verse 25. But I'll leave that for your own conversation afterwards. But just before we close, I just want to focus on Peter for a moment. Focusing on Peter for a moment. Because all of these men that are gathered at the table, in a few moments' time, they're all going to abandon Jesus. They're going to get up and they're going to run. But despite that, I think this is amazing, despite that, Jesus doesn't abandon them. In fact, I love this, that Jesus is actually going to go and find them. He's going to go before them and find them. He's going to go looking for them. He's going to go and find those who have failed miserably and who have wandered away. And I look out at the room and I see lots of faces looking at me, and you see me looking at you. I don't know everybody's story in the room. I don't know all the details. You don't know all the details in my story. But perhaps in years gone by, you've made your blunders. You've made your mistakes. You failed. You were the one that said, it's never going to happen to me, and then bam, it happened to you. You fell flat on your face. Or perhaps it wasn't you. Perhaps it was somebody else, and you're just collateral damage, but it's affected your life for years to come. Loved ones, I love this this portion of the story, because it's incredible, because I believe in the sovereignty and the providence of God. That doesn't mean I can explain why things happen the way they do, but I believe in the providence of God and his purposefulness in moving his plans forward despite our failure and our upset and our hindrance and our failing and fumbling, that God will finish the plans that he has for your life despite what's gone on in the past, that he will move it to completion for his glory and for his purpose, that despite our wanderings, despite our squanderings, despite our wasting of years spent in selfish pursuits that have left us in a bigger mess than we were in before, empty and aching and broken inside, despite all of that, what I say here, I say on the authority of this book, the Bible, that God is able to restore the years lost to sin and selfishness. That he is able to restore the years the swarming locust has eaten, and the mystery of his working, he is able to do it, and he will do it for the prodigal that returns home to him. Praise be to God, who remains faithful to his new covenants, instituted in the blood and body of Jesus, even when his people fumble and fail and wander and squander their opportunities, deny him and desert him. Thanks be to God, who remains committed to his projects even when men and women run from their commitments. I love verse 28. Verse 28, but after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. You're all going to run. You're all going to fall away. Every one of you in the room is going to make a complete mess of the situation. You're going to deny, you're going to betray, you're going to desert, but you know what? I'm going to stick close to you. In fact, I'm going to come find you. You will deny and defect, but I love you, and I will be there for you, and I'm going before you to Galilee. It's wonderful. It's an incredible reminder that as Christians, our assurance, my assurance, your assurance, isn't found in our bravado. It's not found in my bravado of what I can do, but our assurance is in what Christ has done. Our assurance is in the covenant Jesus institutes now with his disciples, a promise that is sealed with his blood. As that one hymn puts it, marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds our sin and our guilt. Yonder at Calvary's mount outpoured, there where the blood of the Lamb was spilt. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin, all our past sin, all our present sin, all of our future sin. It's God's grace that is greater than all of that. And so we have these disciples, and with all of their boasts and their bravado and their failure, there's a fresh start. There's a second chance waiting for them in Galilee. And when I think about that, that is good news. That is great news if you're anything like me. If we're truly honest with ourselves and before God, the whole Christian experience really is an experience of second chances, of fresh starts, of having an opportunity to do a do-over. At least that's how it's been for me. Of learning again and again and of being reminded again and again how easy it is to wander and to stray. And then to have opportunities like this on a Sunday morning when we can come in, we can sit down, we can stand up, we can sing, we can take the bread and be reminded of the fact that his body was broken for our forgiveness. And then to take the cup and be reminded that his blood was shed for our sin. And then to be reminded with renewed confidence as we walk out the door through many dangers, toils, and snares. I have already come. 'Twas grace that's brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And so Jesus takes the Passover, transforms it into the Lord's Supper, and we have this wonderful legacy left for our encouragement. Let's pray together as we conclude our time. Father God, we thank you for